Okay, good morning everyone. Welcome to the Performance and Overview Scrutiny special meeting on the 3rd of June. My name is Robert, I'm a Scrutiny and Policy Officer, and I'm just going to open the meeting with the first item. So, election of chair, item number 1. Do I have a proposer and a seconder, please? Councillor Buckler?
Yes, I'm proposing.
Proposing whom, sorry?
Alistair Neil as chair.
Seconder?
I'll second that.
All in favour? Yeah. Any further nominations? No? Great. That means Alistair Neil, Councillor Alistair Neil, is formally chair, so I'll pass over to you, Chair, for item 2.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you, colleagues. I will endeavour to do what I've done before, which is to keep the meetings as much as possible interesting, but also as much as possible non-partisan. However difficult that can be at times, but it is important. We've got really important work to do as a scrutiny committee, and I know everybody's very committed to that, so I look forward to working with you over the next year on this. Yes, so we're going to move on to the appointment of Vice Chair, and do we have a nomination for Vice Chair, please? Councillor Martin Newell.
Thank you, Chair, and congratulations on your re-election. Could I nominate, please, Councillor Rachel Buckler, please?
Thank you, Councillor Newell, and looking for a seconder. I see Councillor Pavia with your hands up.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I'd like to second that nomination, please.
Thank you. Do we have any other nominations for Vice Chair? So I declare that Councillor Rachel Buckler is Vice Chair for the year ahead, and congratulations to Councillor Buckler.
Thank you, Chair.
Great stuff. So we're going to move on now to the meeting proper, as it were, starting with any apologies for absence. Robert?
None today, Chair.
Thank you. And any declarations of interest? So I see none. We're going to move straight on to the first of the 3 reports. The first 2 reports are, in some ways, we tried to group them together because they're very much about the importance of learning for all children. And so we're very much focused in 2 particular reports today. And we had a pre-meet where we discussed some of the issues, and I just had a chat with colleagues who've entered the room just to give a bit of a heads up with what some of the themes were in the pre-meet. I would ask, if I may, for you to just introduce yourself if you're speaking. We're pleased to welcome Councillor Wright in her new role as a cabinet member to the meeting. So thank you for joining. I know you've been double booked or triple booked in moving from one role to the other. And we're pleased to have senior officers and officers with us, Morwenna, Lucy, Jackie and Hayley, I believe, and it would be great if you could just introduce yourself and your role if you're just prior to speaking. But we'll start with the first of the reports, which is on additional learning needs and additional learning provision, and ask you if you want to summarise any of the key points before we move into questions. So thank you.
Thank you, and Bore da, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity today to bring an update on these key areas of our work within the Inclusion Service. I'm Dr. Morwenna Wagstaff, Head of Service for Inclusion, and with me today I have a number of the senior officers from our service who can introduce themselves, but Jackie Elias, Principal ALN Officer, Dr. Lucy Doyle, Principal Educational Psychologist, and Hayley Page, our Additional Learning Provision and Partnership Lead. For our first report on the statutory review of additional learning provision, or ALP, I'm going to hand over to Jackie and Hayley, who've prepared a couple of slides before taking any questions members may have.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Jacqueline Elias, as Morwenna said, and I'm going to do the introduction and the second slide. The background and context to Monmouthshire's inclusive model is very much based on what the Welsh Government have included in their ALN code, which is that an inclusive education where all pupils access common opportunities in ways relevant to their needs and which ensures that they fully belong to the school community is of benefit for all. That has underpinned the development of the work we've done in the area around specialist provision in Monmouthshire. I'll draw your attention particularly to the bullet point 3, where, it's since 1996, where there was local government reorganisation, we have not had a traditional special school for children and young people with significant and complex ALN. And that provided Monmouthshire with an opportunity to develop a new and different model where we have kept our children with complex ALN as close to their communities as possible by developing specialist resource bases within our local comprehensive and primary schools. Currently, you will see we've got 2 primary specialist resource bases, 2 secondary special resource bases, and a 3 to 19 school providing additional learning provision for children and people with highly complex learning and neurodevelopmental needs. Are we on the second slide? Okay. So you'll see from section 1 of the report the statutory duty that the code places on all local authorities to undertake reviews of, sorry, I'm looking at my slide, I hadn't put it down, sorry. Keep under review the arrangements made by the local authority and by governing bodies of maintained schools in its area. I think particularly look at bullet point 4 of bullet point 3, that we have to consider at a strategic level what provision there is to meet needs and whether that provision is sufficient, and if insufficient in any respects, we need to consider what to do to remedy the matter. And this is something that we have taken on since the implementation of the ALN code and been very proactive in this area. And I think to some extent Monmouthshire has developed systems and processes around this that have led the way in the region.
Thank you, Jackie. So I'm Hayley Page, Additional Learning Provision and Partnership Lead, so currently seconded to the Inclusion Service. So just to give you an overview of the purpose of our reviews for additional learning provision, ultimately we want a consistent and equitable approach for all children and young people to ensure that their additional learning needs can be met within our schools. But through this process, we're also able to share best practice across our schools to identify those really good areas that all of our schools can learn from and develop further. We're also looking at that drive for continuous improvement, particularly across our SRBs. So the most recent additional learning provision review in our SRBs is the second.
Sorry to interrupt, but could you just explain the acronyms if you come to one? Just
of course, sorry. Yeah, of course. So our specialist resource bases are on their second additional learning provision review, which identifies the progress made as well as areas we want to improve moving forward. But within this, as Jackie's already said, it's identifying any insufficiencies. So when we look at our additional learning provision, it's not just about visiting our schools, it's all of the other information that we hold about those schools, the projected numbers of children with additional learning needs coming through, the information that comes through to a range of areas of the inclusion service. So that allows us to look at future planning and look at how we develop our provision, and we're supporting our children and young people to be educated as close to their local communities as possible. So the final slide that we just wanted to highlight are the summary of recommendations that are within the report. So key to this is us working through the priorities in the community and corporate plan. So we're giving every child that opportunity to be part of an inclusive model of education and to make progress from their baseline. So So we are looking to extend our specialist resource-based primary provision in the south of the county, and that reflects the number of spaces that we currently have available in the north, but fewer spaces in the south at present. And again, that's keeping our children as close to their local communities as possible. So we have a satellite class that will open for primary age children in Castle Park Primary in the autumn term of 2025, and it's within the same designation as our existing specialist resource-based model. We're also looking to review the funding arrangements that sits across our specialist resource bases to make sure that there is that equitable offer of staffing, of resourcing across all of those resource bases. And then really thinking about the processes and systems around post-16 and post-16 development, the extended statutory responsibility on the local authority through the Additional Learning Needs and Education Tribunal Act 2018, and that does include an extension of post-16 provision within our specialist resource-based model, which we'd be happy to answer any questions on. We're also looking to continue to reduce the number of children and young people who are educated outside of Monmouthshire in independent and maintained specialist provisions. Again, that brings some of our children back into our specialist resource-based model. And then the final point there is to explore the development of suitable and effective provision for primary age children who have social, emotional and mental health needs, so that we're able to reduce the alternative provision that we are currently accessing, as well as the requirements for out-of-county provision for children across Monmouthshire. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hayley. Thank you, Jackie. We'd welcome any questions from members.
Thank you all. Thank you, Marina, and some very interesting points coming across there. My apologies for interrupting when we got to an acronym, and I know how difficult it is when you're actually working with them all day long, all year long. But a small request, please, but an important one. If it's possible, and we're going to make this point more widely to officers, if you could possibly try to, where you have acronyms in a report, just to have them up front in the report listed as a group. It's kind of like a reference for what they are. It's not only for councillors and committee members, of course, it's for residents. We need to always bear in mind that we're looking at reports that we very much want to engage residents with. And I just wanted to make that point, and it's only a small one, but thank you. So opening for questions, and I see Councillor Bond, your hand up.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you very much for that presentation and the obviously good work that you're doing, and the great review and recommendations you've got and just shared. So the first question is around, well, the one question really is around the additional learning provision and partnership lead role, which you've just alluded to. So it was extended for, or seconded for 2 years, and then it's another year. Is that expected to go on from then? Are we expecting the changes or the recommendation to be implemented within this next year? So the recommendations you've made and the statements such as needs met successfully, I wonder, I'm sure that that's correct, but there's statements such as nearly all schools or many schools or IDPs are variable or most schools. I wonder, where's the evidence? Can we see the 3.4.1 says improvements and progress identified towards priorities in nearly all cases, but is there any way we could see any evidence, please? And could we have, because there's a lot of reference to self-evaluation, and could we, would be there possible to have some information about the numbers of children, young people that are part of this service, please?
Thank you, Councillor Bond. Thank you for your question. I'll try and pick it apart a little bit and probably hand over to some colleagues if that's okay. So in terms of the first point around Hayley's role, so the additional learning provision and partnership lead role, you are correct. Initially that was a 2-year secondment which we were using Welsh Government grant funding for, and that has been agreed for another further year. So we will have Hayley with us for 3 years. We felt as a local authority that was a real priority as we're in in the final stages of full implementation of the ALNet Act and Code, which actually concludes this summer. And I think off the back of that full implementation, we as a team are looking at what the ALN service needs to look like going forward. Now we are within that new legislative framework. So I think there is a piece of work, you're right, to be done there during that period, because what we recognise is much of the work that Hayley does is a requirement of the new legislation and will be cyclical, so we need that built in a sustainable way going forward. So yeah, we're kind of on that at the moment, but yes, absolutely need to consider the structure of the service into the future once that implementation has kind of fully happened. So I hope I've answered that question. In terms of your points around 3.4.1, which was around SRBs and the kind of provision, I don't know, Hayley, are you happy for me to hand over to you to provide a bit of an answer? And in terms of the sort of self-evaluation process as well, I think Hayley might have some more information. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. So the evidence basis of the improvements comes from the ALP review that was conducted in the spring and summer term of 2023.
Sorry to interrupt, was ALP again, please?
Sorry, Additional Learning Provision Review in 2023, so spring summer term 2023, and then the updated review that we completed in the spring term 2025. So we've just completed that. So there are reports, summary reports of both of those additional learning provision reviews that you would be able to access. And then underpinning all of that are the action plans that sit with each of our specialist resource bases. So as an outcome of the initial additional learning provision review in 2023, we created action plans with each of our specialist resource bases. They were focused on key areas, so teaching and learning, curriculum, student wellbeing, inclusion, environment, etc., and targeted based on the outcomes of that initial review. So those initial action plans have been reviewed. They are reviewed at least termly with the SRB leads, and head teachers are part of those reviews, so they see those reviews as well. So we can see the progress that's been made through that, and each of our resource bases had a new action plan for September 2024, and again, those are in the process of being reviewed. So all have been reviewed in autumn and spring term, and there's a further review happening during this term with each of our resource bases. So that, alongside the additional learning provision review, is embedding that self-evaluation process for each of our resource bases. And I think the other part were numbers of children. So we currently have 194 children placed in our resource bases. Because we opened King Henry's resource base fully in September 2024, there are 71 places available in that resource base, and we currently have 20 children in that resource base this academic year due to increase in September. So that does give us capacity in the overall model at the moment. So the total number of places in the current model is 229 available spaces across the board, and 194 of those are taken. That does mean that we are oversubscribed in other resource bases because we are under capacity at the moment in King Henry. But the projection over a 5-year period will be that King Henry will meet that 71 space based on our projected numbers.
Councillor Bond, did you have a follow-up to that?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Hayley. Everybody, great, Moana, great explanations. I wonder, these reports, because as a resident looking at this, there's a lot of statements there that there's evidence behind. I wonder what you could share that residents could see that to reinforce your statements in the report, please. Such as, I guess there's a lot of detail in those school reports and the surveys, which you wouldn't necessarily want to share every bit, but whether there's some summaries or some tangible information that might help support your statements in the report. Thank you.
Thanks,
Councillor Bond.
Oh, sorry.
Yep.
Thank you, Councillor Bond. Yeah, I think that's a really, really valid point. I think we wouldn't be able to share them in their full detail for obvious reasons, but I think we could probably develop a level of summary that could be available, and we could make that possibly available on our external site or something, couldn't we, through schools?
It's part of the duty under the code to actually publish the outcome of reviews, and part of the process. This is obviously a public paper that everyone can see, but I think we could actually add to that by making a sort of a more general report around the review work that we do. I mean, that is something, an expectation of Welsh Government and in the code as well. So I think that's very doable.
And maybe linked to this as well, this report maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll look at doing that. Thank you for that.
Brilliant.
Of course, it would be anonymised. There is no particular obvious reason to me that anonymised information could not be quite properly shared. And it's very much with the interest of supporting it. It's not to do more than that. While we're just on this, and I can see Councillor Buckler's hand up. We're using acronyms quite a lot for perfectly proper reasons, but it's a different point. Really, I was just looking to make that within this school system, there's nothing more stigmatizing than terminology that makes people appear to be in a different place or somehow in a different group from everyone else. And I just wonder to what extent terminology like specialist resource base, which sounds the kind of thing that you might get in NASA, as opposed to within the location of any school, to what extent that's actually terminology that's used that would be within within range of the actual pupils, because the avoidance of stigma is also very important.
I think, and I'm happy to hand over to Hayley in a minute, but I think one of the beauties of our model of specialist resource bases is the children very much belong to the host school, so they wear the host school uniform, and obviously it varies slightly in the different schools, because depending on space and physicality of rooms and things, but in some of our, for the young people themselves, they're just going to their school, so the language, you are correct, wouldn't necessarily be used around those young children. And actually, when we work with our head teachers who host the schools, that's something that's really key for the model for them, is that these children are part of their school communities, and that is the sort of heart of why we really like this model. But you are right, I think in these sort of this public arena, we possibly need to think about that a little bit. I don't know, Hayley, have you got anything else to add to that, or?
Yeah, I would agree. Most of the children in our schools, the mainstream children, as well as the children in the resource space, would not refer to it as a specialist resource space. So in most of our resource spaces, they are named as classes. So if the theme for each of the classes is a tree, then the resource space would also be a tree. So yeah, absolutely. It is something that our specialist teacher group are going to be looking at, because we're keen to change the language used more generally and more widely around our specialist resource spaces as well. So it is something we will be considering moving forward.
Yeah. Great, thank you. I just thought while we were talking about some of those acronyms, it might be useful to know. Thank you very much for that explanation. Councillor Buckler, I see your hand up.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to say thank you to Morwenna and all your team. It's a very complex area and a very necessary one, and we certainly support your work, which is laudable. And thank you very much. I'd like to know how much is currently being spent annually on out-of-county placements, and sort of what is our target for reducing this figure through local investment. There must be a sort of connotation for families where their where children from families who need this specialist provision, have to travel quite a way, and it sort of puts a strain on family life, doesn't it? So that would be interesting to know. Would you say that the quality of provision in individual development plans varies from school to school? And what can we do to make sure it's of the highest standard in every school that has provision? Why does it persist despite guidance and current legislation wanting it to be sort of more uniform? And also, do you feel that the funding models for this specialist resource-based education is actually updated to reflect actual needs and staffing demands and inclusion targets. So, if you could go into that, would be great. Thank you.
Councillor Buck, for clarification, the despite guidance point, you're describing consistent performance. I'm just trying to understand what the guidance was that you were.
Oh, I see. Well, obviously, guidance is that a consistent and high level of specialist resource-based education is. It just seems to vary in some schools in provision. I just want it to be sort of flagged up, I suppose. Obviously we're trying, I'm sure, as a team, you're trying to provide the best and the highest quality. So, it'd be useful for residents to know that you're doing such.
Thank you, Councillor Buck. I just tried to get clarification. That's great. So over to you, Marina, or who's going to pick up?
Thank you, and thanks for those questions, Councillor Buckler. I think, again, we'll pick them off one by one, if that's all right. In terms of costs of out-of-county specialist placements, targets and travel, I don't know, Hayley, if you've got that to hand. I don't. You do, Hayley. Thank you, Hayley, for having that to hand. So part of our model, as Hayley highlighted in our recommendations, is about holding as many of those children in their local communities as possible, so preventing the need for out-of-county placements wherever possible, but also, if appropriate, bringing those children back to our specialist provision. So I don't know, Hayley, if you're able to share some of those broad numbers.
So I have the costs for 2023-2024 academic year independent provision at 2.3 million. Let me just double check I'm saying that correctly. Yes. Transport costs are variable based on where they're going. We know we have an increase in transport costs, and we are going out to tender on a range of transports. It is variable across a year, and changes in independent costs will happen across a year. So we are identifying children whose needs would be met in the Monmouthshire model of specialist resource bases, and that places a level of pressure, particularly at post-16. Bear in mind that all specialist provision goes to the age of 19, so as soon as a placement is given, a child has the opportunity to remain within that provision until 19. So we are looking at appropriate places and points where children can move back into the SRB model or within the mainstream model with support.
Sorry. I was just going to ask, as a quick follow-up on the transport question, has that transport dependency changed in the way that it has for mainstream schools in the light of home-to-school legislation changes, or is it very much as it has been for many years?
It hasn't changed because there is an entitlement if a child goes to a specialist provision that transport is provided. So that is something that we obviously have to honour. We work very closely with our People Transport Unit. We have regular meetings with them to look for efficiencies where that's appropriate, where parents feel able to or can transport pupils to specialist provision. If that's their choice, then we can offer a personal transport budget to them, which reduces our overall cost. But clearly this is needs-led. We have to look at the child and the family and what is obviously in their best interest. So, but clearly we're very, very conscious of the cost of transport, which can be extremely high, especially for children with disabilities being transported to specialist provision out of county. So that's a huge incentive for us to look at what we can develop within Monmouthshire to include. There are benefits in so many ways, obviously for that child and for the family, but clearly there are additional benefits for the local authority in terms of that reducing transport costs, and obviously for the environment as well as the budget.
Yeah.
And just Hayley, on the 2.3 million, are you able to itemise how much of that was transport?
That's not actually including transport, that's placement costs. So that's any out-of-county special school and independent special school without transport.
And are you able to identify then what transport cost is overall?
I don't have the overall transport cost, but we can.
Would it be possible just to fill that?
Yeah, of course.
I think Councillor Buckler's question was very much about the overall costs, and so transport is going to be a significant part of that. Yes, sir, Marwena, I think you were just going to pick up the another couple of points. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. In terms of the second question you raised about the quality of IDP, so individual development plans, and that variance across schools, there is a whole piece of work, again, some of that is outlined in the report around the work going on in our mainstream schools as well as our SRBs. And again, Hayley tends to lead on that with Jackie through our network. So we've got our specialist provision and outreach team network, which includes all of our specialist resource-based lead teachers, but we also have an Elenco forum, so an additional learning needs coordinator, which every school has, where we meet regularly as well to kind of highlight some of those processes. So I don't know, Hayley, would you be happy to offer a little bit more about the QA of those?
Yeah, absolutely. So as part of our additional learning provision, we're looking at the actual provision as it happens in schools, but what we're also conscious of are how the individual development plans are constructed and how they're monitored and reviewed. So we work within clusters, so each of our clusters has an additional learning needs focus. We come together half-termly, generally at least one of those each term, at least one of those meetings would be in person to give us that opportunity to look at and scrutinise some of the paperwork that's present, to share ideas and suggestions of provision that some schools have identified and secured and have an evidence basis for. So I think what's fundamental when we're talking about that additional learning provision across our mainstream schools as well as our specialist resource bases is there an evidence basis for positive impact? And if there is, can we share that more widely? So it's that opportunity for our additional learning needs coordinators to work in collaboration with each other to really secure the right provision for the children in their schools.
Thank you. And Marwena, did you have any?
No, I was just going to pick up then the third point about the funding models for the SRBs in particular in terms of their staffing. So again, in the recommendations, I know we highlighted that there's an ongoing review of the finances. And I think, we've been on a journey with our specialist resource bases over a number of years about making sure that we provide the highest quality provision in a kind of an effective and efficient way, but really trying to understand what those placements actually cost in terms of all of the details of those, so not just teaching staff, but resources, environment, space, and all of those things. So again, we've had really detailed analysis of that, mainly since Hayley's been with us in terms of the development of the partnership agreements that we now have in place with the host schools and between the local authority and the host schools. So I don't know, Hayley, do you want to just offer a little bit more about that process?
Yes, so we've constructed partnership agreements that we've consulted with each of our resource-based leads and their host school head teachers and governing bodies. So they're in the process of being signed off. They're signed off by 4 of the 5 resource bases at the moment. We've just got a further meeting to sign off the last one. But that's very much allowed us to really scrutinise the funding, the cost of each of our resource bases, but taking into account the changing complexity of need. So we have had an increase in the number of children remaining in Monmouthshire in the last number of years. So a reduction in the number of out-of-county and independent special school placements. And with that does come a change in need in our resource bases, and therefore we have to take that into account. So alongside the partnership agreement, we are currently reviewing the funding of each of our resource bases. So each of our resource bases is evaluating fully funding. That includes staffing, but it also considers staff absence, the requirement for agency or backfill staff, the resourcing, the consumables that are required in our resource bases that we don't necessarily think about that would be needed for 14, 15-year-old children that actually is similar to that you'd find in an early years setting. So we're in that process at the moment, and then we're going to be able to put some recommendations together to determine the best way forward to fund each of them on a really equitable basis.
Thank you, Hayley. Very very interesting to hear your reply. Councillor Buckler, did you have any follow-up?
Just a small follow-up. Thank you very much for all the information about the work you're doing in standards in our provision, and also the funding and how it can be best dealt with, that we have sort of value for money as the Mumshires taxpayers. One thing I would like to know is how many pupils currently have out-of-county provision in this. Thank you.
Who's going to pick that up?
I think I'm looking at Hayley's fingers moving very quickly. She's our number. She's our data queen at the moment, and I know you've got. I wonder, should we hold that question and?
Why don't we come back to that?
I was going to say,
there's nothing worse than everyone staring at you trying to find a number.
55.
55.
Yeah.
So that's 55 of the total of...
So 55 separate to our specialist resource-based population, so 55 who are in out-of-county independent or specialist provisions.
And are they also included in the 2.3 million for 23-24,
yes, they would be the costs
excluding transport?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. Councillor Buckler, any further points?
No, that's fine. Thank you.
Good, thank you. I see Councillor Howells with his hand up.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Thank you, everyone. Just a couple of questions from me. Going back to transport, has there been any assessment on how travel time affects attendance or well-being of the additional learning need learners? And also, how are we capturing and responding to the experiences of learners and their families in the special resources bases? And finally, with legislation, are there any areas where the council may be at risk of non-compliance?
Thank you, Councillor Howells. How do you want to take these ones?
I will pick up the first one and then probably again hand over to some colleagues. So thank you, Councillor Howells, for your questions. I think the first point around travel time and the potential impact on young people, children, young people's attendance and well-being is very much at the forefront, I think, of our thoughts often when we make those decisions. And I think probably supports our really strong view about keeping children as close to their communities as possible, and obviously it is as possible because that is needs dependent, and obviously you have to weigh that up, don't you? But some of our out-of-county placements are a distance away, and we do have children who therefore have to travel a distance every morning and every afternoon. I think we do kind of monitor that through our regular reviews, so annual review process that happens as part of the sort of statutory requirements, but are in sort of constant communication or available to families around the impact of that. And I think those are things that we very carefully consider when we discuss placements. So any request for placements or suggestion for placement that comes through our inclusion panel has to have parent and pupil voice on there. And if the child or young person is, for example, non-speaking and so unable to express that in the kind of standard way, we would utilise our educational psychologists or other professionals who know those young people and children well to ascertain as best as we can their kind of views and thoughts about that. But I don't know, Jackie, if you've got anything to add to that.
I mean, it is a factor. There's no, if you're travelling from Monmouthshire to Penarth, where one of our out-of-county schools, that's, I mean, I live in Penarth, so I know it's quite a journey and can be, very stressful, but we do monitor that, and we use strategies, obviously, to help young people pass the time. I mean, thank goodness sometimes for little electronic gadgets that they can use on a long journey, but that's, as Morwenna said, I think it's really critical in our thinking around why we need and why we want to develop more local provision for these children, because keeping them close does eliminate, what can be very stressful journeys if there are, traffic jams or queues or whatever. And equally for our children with significant medical physical needs, for example, epilepsy. Obviously every transport they take, we have to have a risk assessment around them to make sure that everyone around them can keep them safe should they have a medical emergency. So, it is, I think, is part of what we consider every time we place a child, we have to place a child out of county, that the transport and the travel distance is an issue. And we do monitor very carefully, as when it says through review, the child, young person or the parents' views on whether that is becoming a barrier to them attending, and then we address that very specifically if that becomes something that we can't overcome.
In terms of your second point, I guess we've brushed on that a little bit in terms of how we capture and respond to learners' views. So there is the statutory process around the annual reviews that we've talked about. But I guess, and again, I'm happy to hand over to Hayley, who's worked in one of our specialist resource space for a number of years. I guess that ongoing capture of pupil voice is really significant to provision.
Absolutely. So each of our resource spaces work really closely with the families and with the children to be able to capture views. As Morwenna's already said, a lot of our population would be non-speaking within our resource spaces, so capturing their views has to be done in a really careful, creative way to make sure we have that really holistic overview of that child, so including parents, including other professionals, to capture exactly what's going on for that child is really important. So we've got the annual review process, but alongside that we have one-page profiles for each of the children that would be reviewed termly. So we have that opportunity to capture the voice on an ongoing basis.
And I think your final point was around non-compliance. I would hope not. I'm going to hand over to Jackie with a bit more knowledge and experience.
I think Council House is looking for assurance rather than
I can actually assure you, in terms of the ALN Act and its implementation, and obviously we've got until August the 31st to ensure that all our old statements are converted to IDPs, and we will be fully compliant with that. We're getting through all of those now, and I think, hand on heart, just to reassure you, we are fully compliant with all the requirements of the ALN Act.
Thank you.
That's good to know. I didn't expect that question, and it's good that we had the answer as well. Just a couple of follow-ups, if I may, on the very interesting questions and answers. For example, and you used the example, Hayley, of Monmouthshire to Penarth. I just wonder, do we consider any options that might be better for the young person across the border in England, in Gloucestershire or Herefordshire? And if I may just the supplementary on that, do we have any out-of-county placements from other counties within our available locations within Monmouthshire?
Of course, yeah. So when a decision's made to consult with a specialist provider, independent or maintained, we would be considering all available options. So we're going out to determine whether any of those settings could meet the identified need to provide the additional learning provision within the individual development plan, and then have to do a really robust analysis of where that child's needs are going to be best met, which could include across the border in England or within the region, but on occasion does require going beyond that area. So yes, there's a full analysis. We have to look at transport, we have to look at additional learning provision requirements. And then the second part, we do have children who are outside of Monmouthshire within specialist resource spaces at the moment. So given that some of our schools are on the border, we do have Herefordshire and Gloucestershire children currently accessing some of our specialist resource spaces in older year groups on the whole.
Okay, thank you. So there is some kind of exchange or leeway given. If there weren't, everyone would be rigidly working with the capacity within their own county. I can understand that.
I think we need to add that the capacity of all specialist provision now is under extreme. Most special schools are full, and that's has particularly obviously we talked in the first slide about the reorganisation in '96, where the 4 other local authorities that used to be had special schools and Monmouthshire didn't. At that point, we were able to, and when I first joined Monmouthshire even, we had a kind of a number of children placed in those out-of-county special schools within the region and in England. But increasingly, when we go to consultation, schools are saying quite legitimately, we are full and we've got a waiting list. And I think that, again, has contributed to our strategic review and discussion around what we need to develop in Monmouthshire, because whilst we have as well as the child's needs, we also have to consider parental preference for placements, which we have to consult on wherever they want us to consult, whether it's in England or in Wales. But increasingly, the response is coming back from local authorities that all provision is full, which gives us even more impetus, I think, to actually consider what we need to grow within Monmouthshire itself. I think that's a really important factor. The choice is not out there anymore for specialist provision within the region or across the border.
Thank you, Jackie. Just to recognise that I'm sure the 100% of the effort that you would be all looking to make is on the development of the young person's learning and the development of the young person themselves, rather than hunting for capacity in which you can actually do that very thing that you're focused on. So we're very very understanding of that, and thank you for all the hard work that you do. I see Councillor Pavia. Councillor Howells, did you have any follow-up?
No, thank you. Thanks for the results.
And Councillor Pavia.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Thanks for everyone for presenting this morning. Just in terms of the second review, and it's obviously great to see we've got a robust cycle of review in place. That's really good to see. I think we've sort of referenced the most recent report. I know in this time last year when we had when we looked at the same report, as it were, we had that report as an appendix. So hopefully we'll be able to see a copy of that report as quickly as possible as a committee. Just in terms of the recommendations in the previous report that was presented last year, and just looking at the recommendations this year, not sort of going back over the previous report, but there were some that look quite familiar. I'm just trying to understand in terms of the recommendations from last year, were all those achieved? Are there any carried over that have sort of formalised into this reporting document? In terms of budgetary pressures, and I think we're all acutely aware broadly outside of our school resource bases in terms of the pressure that's on all our schools. And I suppose it's trying to understand how the council is going to mitigate some of the impact of those budgetary pressures, particularly on additional learning needs coordinators, time and support staff in schools. And the other key element, I think, is the emotional literacy support assistants, the ELSA assistants. Many of those who are teaching assistants, and I think, again, referenced in the report, there's issues about attrition, and there's a danger, I think, potentially schools looking to make ends meet may look to make redundant those posts ahead of teaching posts, and then we're in danger of losing a resource, a capacity the council has invested in, schools have invested in, and we lose that pastoral and interventional support in schools. So I'd just be welcome to understand how the council's working. I think Hayley said across the clusters, just to identify and understand each cluster and the schools and where the potential weaknesses are in terms of potentially losing some of those key members of staff. I think finally, Chair, in terms of understanding how the council's planning to meet increased demand from pupils with both social, emotional and mental health challenges, but also the neurodevelopmental needs locally. And I think, it's great to see the additional capacity in the north of the county in King Henry, in the secondary school there. But I think in the report, there are obviously issues around capacity in some of our primary schools. There's additional places required. But also, I suppose, is understanding the pipeline, working with colleagues in health to understand the backlog in assessments, those neurodevelopmental assessments. And I just, are we assured of the challenge that's coming forward in terms of what's in the pipeline to still be processed in terms of those assessments and what potentially could come out of that? So I'd be interested to understand how the council's planning to meet that increased demand. Sure.
Thank you, Councillor Pavia. There's quite a lot there, so I'm going to just ask Morwenna and colleagues just to see if you could deal with the core of each point, because we will need to move on also.
Yeah, absolutely, and thank you for your questions, Councillor Pavia. Yeah, in terms of, I'm not sure on your first point around recommendations. I know that there are some of the recommendations that feel familiar, and I think that those are the ones where we would highlight that work is kind of ongoing or progressing along the lines of, but we're not, where we want to be. And you are right in terms of that detail in the report. Last time you've reminded me came through as an appendix, but we will try and get that to you as soon as possible so you have that further detail. The budgetary pressures, you're correct. That is, you're all very well aware of the pressures that schools are facing, both the pressures on our Elenco, so the additional learning needs coordinators, which every school is required to have, in terms of time to do the role, but also in terms of, increasing sort of demand and complexity of needs coming through our system. And you're right again around that teaching assistant and the kind of, at times, the kind of transient nature that we can commit, and a school can commit and train up staff to do a number of different skills, and then often they are lost. So I guess in terms, and I won't pick up on the emotional literacy support assistant too much because I know that's in the next paper, but in terms of that role, for instance, I guess the way that we support those schools is a continual rolling programme of professional learning and development. So we have, our ELSA training happens on an annual basis. We have ongoing kind of CPD events, but across the board, so not just around the ELSA model, but around sort of, working with those support staff. So where there is that movement of staff, and there is, we can always provide that kind of that high quality training and support to ensure that whoever is in that role, is well trained and prepared. We spend a lot of time with our Elencos as a collective group, so not just in cluster groups, but also as a local authority. We're lucky in some ways being so small, they can all fit in a room, and we have regular ALNCO forums, so additional learning need coordinator forums, where we have almost all, I would say, pretty good attendance at those 3 times a year, and that is an opportunity for us as a local authority to, to bring in speakers, to bring up issues that are kind of being raised, and to support our Elencos to do what is actually a challenging role in our schools and settings. I don't know if Hayley or Jackie want to pick up on any of those before I pick up on the last point. Anything to add to that around sport? And I think, as you have highlighted, the recommendation and our kind of awareness of that growing need in our primary sector around the social, emotional and mental health needs that children and young people are presenting with, and the neurodevelopmental needs is very much on our radar, on our agenda, and is part of our forecasting and projecting how we're going to support those learners going forward. So there's very much a lot of work going on in that space currently. I think to pick up the point about the neurodevelopmental assessment, and again, not to go down a sort of a rabbit warren, as it were, but we have identified that as an area of priority for us because of the numbers of children we have with neurodevelopmental needs, including autism. And I hope that you'll all be aware that Monmouthshire were the first authority in Wales to roll out the Autism in Schools and Setting programme in partnership with the Autism Education Trust, and that is a programme that was developed over 3 years in partnership with the Autism Education Trust, and now is embedded and being embedded in all of our schools. I think we have all of our schools trained at a level of sort of whole school awareness around making sense of autism, and that will continue. We've got our good autism practice being rolled out from the autumn term, which is for those members of staff who are supporting children with more complex neurodevelopmental needs. And I think just on the final point, we are a needs-led service, so a child does not require a diagnosis to have their needs met in Monmouthshire, and that has always been the case. So a child's needs will be met based on how they present, and the provision will be put in place accordingly. It does not depend on them having the diagnosis or not, which enables us to continue to support children and young people, whether they're on that pathway, whether they haven't started that pathway, or actually whether they have got a diagnosis and then post-diagnosis. So we're very proud to be a needs-led service, and with the particular problems that health are having with the backlog around assessments, we're really glad that we are, because we don't have lists of children kind of waiting in the wings. We would say with confidence that our schools are really good at identifying those children and trying to meet their need as best that they can at the earliest point where those needs are kind of presented. Anything to add? Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Morwenna. And Councillor Pavey, did you want to follow up on any of those points?
No, that's fine, thanks, Chair.
Can I just expand a little bit on this point about needs being the driver of the work that we do, which sounds highly commendable and something that I'm sure I'd want to support. I'm just trying to understand what that would mean in practice. So would it mean that a child might be placed on a pathway without having a diagnosis? And is that not actually also capable of being the wrong pathway if a diagnosis follows and the child is not diagnosed with a particular need for which the pathway has been set? We wouldn't apply that to other health settings. So I just wondered, how we deal with that.
So I think the terminology a needs-led service is ultimately focused on that person-centred approach to meeting the needs of children, young people and adults, and actually that is a model that is replicated across health. And I think for us it's about understanding the individual, and Hayley mentioned earlier the one-page profile. So the one-page profile is about identifying for any child or young person in our school who's presenting with a barrier to learning what their needs are, what's important to them, what's important for them, how we would support them, this kind of support that works or not. And I think the confidence for us comes from a child who may go on, for example, to later have a diagnosis of autism, may present in early years with speech, language and communication difficulties. It would be that we would focus on in terms of the needs that they have, and therefore the provision and the intervention put in place in an early years setting or in their school would be a response to that need, and then that would be closely monitored over time in terms of progress, and then the next intervention or provision would be kind of identified through that process in partnership with the parents and the child themselves. I think our provision is not determined by a diagnosis, because we could line up 1,000 children who have the same medical diagnosis who actually present in very different ways, so their needs are different, because autism as an example is a spectrum disorder, so actually we can present that there's lots of different presentations. I can see Jackie wants to add.
I'm nodding in agreement, Morwenna, and I think it's important to understand that for many children with barriers to learning or additional learning needs, there's a common denominator in terms of approaches and strategies that will support them. And the first, of course, being a really good inclusive school and classroom. And I think that's the most important thing about our model and our approach, is that it's one, in fact, that when we were in discussions with the new developmental team in Welsh Government and others, that they're approaching, that actually there's not a strategy and approach that you could do that would do any harm. It is all about good practice and best practice, which actually, whether you have a diagnosis or no diagnosis, whether you've got dyslexia or whether you've got additional needs associated with autism or attention deficit disorder, there's good practice, there's approaches that actually will meet the needs of all those children. And I think that's something that is fundamental to our approach, and particularly our work with schools, is about, and working with our colleagues in school improvement as well, which is a critical factor. It's about that, and the code talks about high quality, inclusive teaching and learning. And I think that is where we centre on. When it comes to the top of our needs pyramid, yes, of course, some children require some very specialist approaches and interventions, but for the vast majority, I think our approach is one that is one that where you create the least barriers to children accessing the best approaches for them. And the one-page profile, the person-centred, child-centred approach is really fundamental to what we do.
Thank you, Jackie. I suppose it's very much about the meaning of the words behind diagnosis, and it sounds from what you're saying like it's very much assessment based. How can it be anything other than that? Even in informal terms, for which a pathway is put forward. That's very helpful, very clear, and thank you. Councillor Garrett, I see your hand up.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you. I think, Morwena, you answered my question earlier, but it was really about what are the criteria for pupils to go to the bases, and basically you said they don't need a statement. So how has that helped then to reduce? We've heard stories in England of parents going through long appeal process over getting a statement of special educational needs. Does the Monmouthshire model remove that kind of parental challenge to the system? Are parents happy and satisfied with this situation, this system? And you're trusting teachers as well, which is great, because the professional opinion of teachers ensures that those pupils get into the bases much quicker and maybe get the support they need, and hopefully maybe it will encourage some of them to develop, and maybe they won't need that support in future. But it was really just around the criteria, and the fact we don't need a statement for pupils to join. I think that's really great, and I just wondered whether that's had a positive effect then on parental satisfaction with what's being offered in Monmouthshire. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Garrett.
Thank you, Councillor Garrett. I think that's my possible miscommunication. For our children to access our specialist resource bases, those placements are determined by panel, and most of the children, if not all of the children, do have a statutory plan, so would have an individual development plan that reflects their additional learning needs and their required additional learning provision to meet those needs. That's because our children who access our specialist resource bases are amongst our most complex learners within Monmouthshire. So they would have that statutory plan. In terms of parental and carer kind of input into those, again, the bit that's crucial in there is, Jackie alluded to it earlier, that parental choice and parental views are really significant to us when we are consulting and seeking and considering whether a child requires specialist provision, and we take that into account very much so. It doesn't always mean that parents get what they're requesting, because obviously we have to look at that at a strategic level in terms of the needs across both our kind of whole authority in terms of needs, but also the capacity we have and the forecasting that we have. But we do, obviously, through at least the annual review process, for children who have an IDP, an individual development plan, parental and carer review and voice is key to that. It's a person-centred practice, so they're involved in that process. And as Hayley highlighted earlier, for children who are within our specialist resource bases or who are in our mainstream schools with a high level of need, so may have a high level of support identified in an individual development plan, there would be more, good practice would be that there would be more regular reviews and liaisons with parents and carers around how they feel that provision is providing for their child or young person's additional learning needs. And obviously that changes over time because children change and develop, and the requirements to meet their needs will differ. So that's another key sort of factor and role in that kind of person-centred position that we take in everything we do around additional learning needs. I don't know, Jackie or Hayley, if you've got anything to add to that. I hope that answers your question, Councillor Garrett.
Councillor Garrett, are you content with that?
Just to clarify. So, do we have are there any cases where there are appeals going on for parents to get pupils into the bases, or is the system working well enough that those pupils in need are getting access to the special teaching sooner? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Garrett. I'll hand over to Jackie.
Currently, Councillor Garrett, we do not have any appeals to the Educational Tribunal for Wales for placements in specialist resource provision, but obviously over the years we haven't. We obviously consider every case on its merits, and where, as Moen has already alluded to, our resource bases are for children with the most complex needs, and obviously we do have to make a decision sometimes that we feel a child's needs could be appropriately met within a mainstream setting with support, and clearly parents have within the legal framework the right to take us to appeal if they disagree with us. But generally we have a very good relationships with the majority of our parents. We have, wherever we can, we use mediation, disagreement resolution to talk through how we can come to an agreement about the best outcomes for a child or young person prior to a tribunal. But obviously sometimes, a tribunal is the best option for both the local authority and the parents because it's an independent panel making a decision. And we always emphasise just that if we have a tribunal with a parent, we always emphasise that whilst this may appear to be something that is, a conflict, we always emphasise we are working with you and with your child for the rest of that child's time in our education, and therefore our relationship with you as parents and with the child remains paramount. So, hopefully, even though tribunals can, be quite stressful for both parents and local authority officers, I may say, generally, we use them. They're only happening, cross fingers, quite rarely within Monmouthshire at the moment, but that position could change.
Thank you. And Councillor Garrett, you content with that thorough reply?
Yes, thank you, and thanks for the report as well. Thanks, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I know, Councillor Buckler, you had a supplementary you wanted to just ask at the end on out of county.
Yes, thank you. Sorry, another bite at the cherry. Bearing in mind that, that you've mentioned there's a sort of heavy reliance on out-of-county provision and the enormous cost of it as well, and the rising need that you've identified, are there any plans at all to provide our own specialist provision school?
Thank you for the question, Councillor Buckler, and I think I smile really because we very much consider our network of specialist resource bases as our special school, and we are one of only 2 local authorities in Wales who do not have a discrete specialist provision, as one building as it were, for a special school. And I think, although as Jackie highlighted, I think in 1996 or whenever, it kind of happened by accident when the counties were separated, but we feel very strongly now, and it has been supported both by Estin visits and sort of conversations we've had at Welsh Government level, that our model of keeping our children as close to their communities as possible, because there's benefits for them in the future, but also for the communities, that model of a specialist resource base, is fine, is good, is what we want to do, because Monmouthshire has such great distances between it. The potential is that if we had one single special school, we'd have a lot of children travelling quite significant distances to go to it, potentially, depending where they live. So we're definitely... I think our model at the moment works. We feel that the sort of modular approach, for want of a better word, with the ability, as we're demonstrating this autumn, to set up a satellite SRB provision in the south of the county to meet need, is enabled through our model. I guess without being able to predict the future, and acknowledging the numbers that we have with, our current model, we have 229 places available. That is the size of a specialist provision. It is the size of a small school. So I think, again, that's something for us over time, and it's kind of on our radar of how best to manage that going forward in terms of the model and that, as you say, that increased kind of demand and capacity we may require as we move forward. I don't know. Have you got anything to add? Does that answer?
Can I just come back to you on what you've said about that? I actually wasn't particularly thinking that every child that needs this provision should be in one specialist school. I'm thinking, because you have mentioned that in different locations there are constraints, whether it's rooms and there'll be staffing, and bearing in mind that some of our pupils who have these specialist needs are travelling great distances. Is that, whether it would be specialist provision being enlarged in locations around. I'm just saying that there seems to be a strain on your services with this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we would acknowledge that. And I think, as Hayley highlighted earlier, we have less children going out to out-of-county provisions now than we did before. And we are holding on to some of those children who historically would have gone out to out-of-county specialist provisions. And that's because of the level of specialism and the high quality of our specialist resource bases in Monmouthshire. I think the point to note, which is that kind of designation, we currently have one designation for our SRBs and for our specialist resource bases, and I think the consideration for us as we go forward is whether we need a different designation of need as well, because some of those children who go to those out-of-county placements are there for different reasons, different presentations of need, so they wouldn't necessarily all fit within one. So it could be that they have really complex physical and medical healthcare needs, for example. It could be that they have, significant dysregulated behaviour that, can't be managed within our SRBs, or in the environment isn't suitable. So the reasons for those out-of-county placements, isn't always the same. But I think you're right in terms of that. Do we need to expand our provision? Do we need to develop the kind of designation of those provisions? Is definitely something that we are strategically considering in lots of detail currently, because we have got that ability to an extent to forecast the trends that we're seeing. And obviously part of this Chapter 7 statutory requirement is to ensure that we have sufficient provision for that. So that is, not off the table at all, but it's the kind of working through what, where and how, I guess. I don't know if you've got anything to
I think it's exactly that, Morwenna. You've referenced that we've got the statutory duty under Chapter 7 to review our additional learning provision within Monmouthshire. Part of that is looking at where the insufficiencies are, and if we're and with all the data certainly that Hayley has been collecting over the last two and a half years, we'll be able to forecast that there are emerging new needs that we don't have a specialist provision designation for at the moment. That's really helpful. The code is really helpful for us in terms of we can identify the insufficiencies, and then at the moment really doing a lot of work behind the scenes, looking at what those options could be in order to meet those insufficiencies. And I think, it's a watch this space at this point in time, because we're doing a lot of the work and the number crunching around the information that's coming through the forecasting work that Hayley's been doing, and I think it's an evolving dynamic model we've got in Monmouthshire. I think that is what's so impressive about it, is that we're not saying we've got a school and this is it. We're actually looking at the children, the needs of the children, and how they're changing coming forward, and actually responding to that. And that's why I think our model is the heart of our model, keeping children close to the communities, is the most critical thing. And how we develop going forward is it's really up to, obviously, not a lot of reports that potentially go forward to council ultimately, but I think it's at the centre of this. We are always looking at ways that we can develop and improve and bring our children back where that is appropriate and where we know we'd be able to offer the best and high quality provision for them.
Thank you. Thank you for some very thorough responses to an important question. I see no more hands up, so I'm just going to note this report for the committee, and that we have scrutinise it. And before moving on to the next item, it's just to say thank you, not only for everybody being here, and I don't know whether my expectation is probably that Moena and Lucy are staying for the next report. You're all going to stay.
Yes.
Well, fantastic. In that case, I'll also say, just for this particular report, if you'd be kind enough to pass on to all the staff who are doing such amazing work on a daily basis, that the questions that we've been asking can sound sometimes a little bit, kind of cold, but we absolutely at the heart of this, I know I'd be speaking for everybody in the committee, that we hugely value the work that's being done by all staff, and be very grateful if you could just pass that back on from the Performance and Overview Committee.
We will absolutely do that. Thank you.
That's great. So and we'll move on to the next agenda item, and that is supporting vulnerable learners. I'm going to see if we could manage this one within a half hour or so, and we'll take a short break at that point before we get on to the next report. So if I could just remind everybody, just if you could recognise we've got quite a lot to get through, but we'll aim for a maximum of half an hour in this one. Thank you.
Thank you. And yes, we will aim to keep it short and sweet. So I think the second of the report, the second report that we're bringing to you today, and welcome the opportunity, is one that outlines and updates members on and our residents on a number of our approaches in supporting the needs of vulnerable learners in our schools and settings. And we've identified particular approaches, including trauma-informed approaches, the Emotional Literacy Support Assistant, the ELSA programme, Monmouthshire Specialist Teaching Service, and the Education Support Team. And I think I will happily, myself and Lucy in particular, would welcome any questions or comments that any members have.
Thank you. And I'm just looking at any hands going up. Whilst I see Councillor Bond.
Thank you very much. Again, applaud you for the great work you're doing. Again, there's thoughts about there's about ELSA particularly, about is it ELSA training available to all pupils, and I wonder if there's a move towards social and emotional learning in schools, and emotional, healthy and nurturing schools. Is that something we're working towards? Is there, because I note that there's lots of information about training the professionals and practitioners. I wonder about, because I'm actually a psychotherapist myself, so really very aware of how we need to help young people understand what's going on for themselves cognitively, socially, emotionally, and how that helps them not have the red mist moments and whatever. So I wonder if there's anything that what you're doing in that respect as for individuals themselves rather than just the practitioners. And the other question was, again, qualitative and quantitative information. Please, can we see some more? The 68 to 70 placements that have been remained in situation is fantastic. Well done, brilliant work. And I didn't understand the word recued. Could you explain what that is, please? Perhaps I misread it. One other thing, just one tiny thing. Couldn't open the reports. So if the qualitative and whatever, quantitative information might be there, but I couldn't open reports. Whether it's because it's on my Monmouthshire doc or on the Modern Gov or whatever, I don't know. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Bond. And yeah, we're all interested to know what recued means. Maybe that one's the one that you could start with. The issue of the reports came up with a number of members. Basically, the linked reports wouldn't open, and whether that was intentional or not. But yeah, thank you.
I will pick up on our spelling mistake first. Thank you, Councillor Bond. I've actually circled it in my report as well. And expressed it to colleagues earlier this morning and realised that recruit should be reduced. So sorry, but it didn't. So no, not at all. It is honestly circled in my report as well. So apologies for that. I think if I sort of just pick those off again. So in terms of ELSA, so Emotional Literacy Support Assistant training, you're correct. That is training for staff. That is training that's focused on teaching assistants. not pupils, and that is a training programme that we've run for a number of years now with great success across Monmouthshire, and we have at least one ELSA in every one of our schools and in many of our settings as well. So that's an ongoing piece of work, and in a moment I might hand over to Lucy if you want any further information around that. In terms of sort of the SEMH needs you referred to in school, so social, emotional, mental health needs, we also, that sits within the inclusion service, is our healthy settings service, and one we are fortunate to have Emma Taylor, who is the regional lead for the whole school approaches to emotional health and well-being within the region, but also within Monmouthshire, and that is based on the statutory framework from Welsh Government around emotional health and well-being in schools, and the expectations that all of our schools should have action plans and should be moving towards exactly what you said, working towards being, emotionally healthy settings and environments. And obviously that also links back to the points we were making earlier about an inclusive educational system, accounts for all of those needs as well as the kind of complex learning needs that we've referred to earlier today. So there is a lot of work going on in that space, both within the realm of the work that the Educational Psychology Service and the Education Support Team do, but also throughout other areas of the inclusion service who have a specific remit around healthy schools and settings, which encompasses emotional and mental health needs as well as kind of physical, more traditional views on healthy schools. So I don't know, Lucy, is there anything you want to add around ELSA training?
Just to add that, I think Councillor Bond mentioned about what's available for all pupils. So ELSA is available for all pupils. Schools will identify pupils for that time-limited intervention, though our ELSAs do other work, so check-ins and supporting pupils into school in the morning. We also have our trauma-informed professional learning offer, so we have that as a whole school sort of universal preventative training, so that would pick up some of that, what's available there for all pupils universally. Just to pick up, Councillor Pavia earlier mentioned about TAs and about ELSAs potentially moving out of schools. We had thought about offering the initial ELSA training biannually, but actually we ask our schools every summer, the summer term, about need around initial ELSA training, and last year there was enough interest to fill an additional course, and so we offered that in the autumn term, and again we've already asked our schools this summer. And again, we've already had quite a few of our schools asking for places on initial ELSA training. So the need is there. We're making sure that we do offer that as a rolling annual course, so that we remain as we are, which is that there are ELSAs in every single one of our schools and settings. I think, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. And were you content with those? I can see, Councillor Bond, you have your hand up. That doesn't mean you're not content, it just means you've got another question.
Thank you very much. No, content with those, but also, Lucy, I was actually meaning, thank you for the information, but I was actually meaning how to help children and young people help themselves, understand themselves, and get the tools to be able to cope with the changes they're going through during adolescence and trauma-informed and any other impact, ACEs, what other impact within their lives. So it's a general, I was talking about helping young people help themselves rather than external interventions from professionals. So it's what you said is brilliant and fantastic, but I was also particularly interested in how we're helping people. But as Morwenna said, it's in the curriculum that we're working towards anyway. But thank you. That's great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. It sounds like you have answered your own question there in part, but that's very efficient. I don't know if, Lucy, you wanted to answer or add anything to that?
No, just to add, I suppose that the ELSA model is that we're not relying on external professionals to support young people. They're part of the, familiar, emotionally available adults in the school, as school staff.
I didn't mean external, I meant external to the young person. Sorry, not external to the school. Sorry, I meant how to help young people manage their own emotion and social interactions and development. Thank you.
Okay. I don't know if anyone wants to add anything to that, but briefly, if you would.
Yeah, very briefly. So just in terms of the curriculum development and health and wellbeing being an area of learning experience, that's a massive focus for each of our schools to really think about how they develop independent and resilient learners.
That's really good to hear, actually. Yeah, great. Thank you. Thanks for the question as well, Councillor Bond. So, Councillor Buckler.
Sorry, Chair, I didn't realise I was next. I was just letting myself drift off for a moment.
I think you are.
Sorry. I've been...
Do beg your pardon. I can see it's actually Councillor Crook that's next.
Okay.
It's my mistake. I couldn't see the little hand against the logo up there, Councillor Crook, so my apologies. Sorry to both of you, but Councillor Crook.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for these reports. If I refer you to page 2, and it's the 3.410 risk or concerns, there are 3 areas there that perhaps you can give us some more information or highlight us. The schools having the time, and then the commitment to changing processes, and then an over-reliance on grant funding. It just obviously gives me concerns. I just wanted some sort of clarification from you, really, as to where we are with that as a concern going forward.
Thank you, Councillor Crook. I'll start, and I might hand over to Lucy if that's okay. So, yeah, absolutely. We've highlighted those as kind of risks or concerns, in particular around the trauma-informed approaches and practice. So I think, you know, as has been alluded to in this meeting so far, there are pressures on our schools, and in particular on the availability of support staff. And I think at times, when we're talking about children who are presenting with distress or dysregulation, it is about having that emotionally attuned, available adult, and I think that's just a risk. I think it's just giving a nod to that risk. As Lucy has highlighted, and Hayley and Jackie, you know, we have an ongoing support and development programme for all of our schools, for all staff, and we are acknowledging that, but I think it is just that the risk associated with there perhaps being fewer support assistants or available adults in a setting or a school, which then can have an impact on how a situation is responded to. We have a commitment from so many of our schools to embed this really good practice, and as Hayley highlighted, it's outlined in the new curriculum for Wales. It's also a statutory framework in the whole school approaches to emotional health and wellbeing, but it's just that acknowledgement that is a real pressure for some of our schools, particularly with what we're seeing as an increased need there. So, you know, it's balancing those elements. In terms of, I think, I guess that's linked a little bit to the second point as well around, you know, there are these statutory frameworks and guidance around developing emotional health and wellbeing across the curriculum, and you know, that's a change for our schools, isn't it? We're in the process of change, so it's just again acknowledging how we as a local authority are supporting our schools with that change to make sure that their, you know, policies, that their practice is in line with those expectations, legislation. But again, that's a challenge, is, you know, it's just kind of giving the nod to that really, and making sure that we are being trauma informed or relational in our practice across the board in all different areas, so not just the obvious ones, but across our interactions with children, young people and their families. And I think the third point, so the over-reliance on grant funding, with a particular focus on the trauma-informed approaches, we initiated our trauma-informed work sort of substantially following the COVID pandemic, where there was Welsh Government funding specifically around wellbeing and the return of children to school. That funding has continued, but it's a year-by-year funding model, so there's kind of that caution around that. I think we've responded to that really proactively in Monmouthshire, in that we have now developed, and that's outlined in the report. Lucy's put the detail in around how we are developing our in-house model of professional learning and training with that in partnership with Traumatic Stress Wales and other local authority teams and services, and that's so that should that grant funding come to an end, we don't know if it's going to or not, we actually have a Monmouthshire sustainable model that the Educational Psychology Service and other colleagues will be able to continue to manage and roll out into the future. So I don't know, Lucy, if you've got anything to add to any of those points, but I hope that's answered some of your questions, Councillor Cook.
You're content with that, Councillor Crook? Good, thank you. So, yeah, we are now on to Councillor Buckler.
And Councillor Crook will be delighted to know that some of my points were covered by his questions. So that's shortening our time. You have highlighted that, the service is fragile in relation to grant applications, but that's interesting to hear, how you're proceeding, and also that there are the schools that are, committed to embedding trauma-informed training. It's sort of critical, isn't it? Thank goodness, long are the days gone where if you had dyslexia, you were considered stupid. Extraordinary leaps and bounds in the understanding, and obviously as a team you're working very well. One thing I'm particularly interested in, Lucy, is the provision of educational psychologists, which is key to understanding. So how do you feel? Do you feel very stretched? Do you feel you've got enough of you in your team? And how do you manage what must be quite a large expectation from parents as well as schools on your service?
Thank you, Councillor Buckley. Buckler. In terms of the national educational psychology picture, there is a national shortage of educational psychologists. I think we feel really lucky in Monmouthshire that we're at full capacity in terms of educational psychologists, and we are able to support Cardiff University and have trainee EPs training with us, which is also really useful. In terms of being stretched, I think we are lucky that we are able to engage in the preventative work and approaches that so that we are upstream of what's happening in our schools. So the ability to provide the professional learning offer around trauma-informed approaches and ELSA, and a number of the other approaches and professional learning that we offer. And that helps us to make sure that our schools kind of feel universally able to meet a broad need. Every school has a link educational psychologist, and in terms of demand, you're right, there'll never be enough EP time. Our schools always ask for more. But we work really closely with our schools to understand what's happening, and we're lucky that we don't have lots of schools, so we really can get into the skin of what's happening individually in our schools, so that each EP, educational psychologist, will understand what's happening systemically and strategically, and then also work with the additional learning needs coordinator to identify and prioritise individual young people to work with, but always looking at the broader picture of what's happening in that school, what need is there, what training need. In terms of how we manage parental and carer expectations, it is the schools that prioritise our EP time and the young people that we work with. So we work really closely, or educational psychologists work very closely with the ALNCO, the Additional Needs Learning Needs Coordinator, and they will have conversations with parent carers around the graduated response, around what they're putting in place to support young people, and involve the educational psychology service in the most timely way. But there are other ways they can access our service, so they can speak to us anonymously. We have online for example, EBSA, so emotionally based school avoidance sessions. It's where we can problem solve, where we have other schools that will join in with the conversation. So there are many different ways that schools can gain that advice and support collaboratively with the educational psychology service. Has that answered your question?
Yeah, thank you very much, Lucy.
Thank you, Lucy. That's a very comprehensive reply. Moving on now to Councillor Newell.
Thank you, Chair. And it's nice to meet the panel and the officers at the front of the chambers there. Very comprehensive reports I've been reading and listening to. Very great work. I've only just got a couple of very small issues, if I can. And they're not really issues. It's more about the language of some of these reports. If I could just refer my colleagues to page 6, 3.5.2. It was just that some of the language is a little bit misleading or not detailed enough for me. Supported self-evaluation outcomes to date. We've got words like many schools have worked, all schools, then the next nearly all schools, then most schools, majority of schools, individual development plans. I was just wondering, moving forward, if maybe we could have, say, numbers or percentages, just to have a little bit more clarity on what these phrases mean. It's just a small observation from me. And a second and very small point, 3.7.6, the 70 pupils supported, 68 of these pupils remained successfully in their school placements. EST supported the identification of transition of one pupil to a special school placement and supported a managed move to another Monmouthshire primary, which is great work. My question is, are there provisions in place for that other one missing young person that's not included in this figure to follow up on how they're developing? And thank you, Chair, for the opportunity.
Thank you. I don't know who wishes to pick that up. It might just be a question of language on 3.7.6.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you for your question and your observations, Councillor Newell. The language of the reports in terms of the most, the many, the almost all is actually Estin language. That's the language that they use, and it is quantifiable in terms of there is a categorisation. So I think in reflection of Councillor Neil's point about needing that glossary, when we do that, we will create that, and in that we will include the glossary of the language that links, because that does talk about, and Hayley will know this better than me because she is a PRS and inspector, but it's that quantifiable language. So that is, we do that on purpose because that is the language that we would utilise if, in those kind of reviews, and that would be the expectation, that Estin would use. I don't know if you've got anything to add on that, but we can absolutely include that as part of the kind of glossary that we definitely will have for the next time we come. In terms of your point around the education support team, and you are right, I'm just reading that sentence, it does feel like there's a missing person there. I don't know, Lucy, you've probably got a bit more knowledge to that paragraph.
It might be how I've worded the sentence. So 68 of the pupils remained in their school placements. The 69th pupil moved to a special school placement, and then the final pupil was supported on a managed move into another one of our mainstream schools.
It's just, I think, a misunderstanding that it appeared that the last pupil was the 69th, but I think it's very, very helpful. But it demonstrates that our committee members, boy, do they read the reports. There have been a number of corrections or questions that it demonstrates that they really read the reports, and I think that's also a good reflection on the amount of useful information that's in the reports. But thank you. Councillor Neil, were you content with those responses?
I am. They're very detailed responses, and thanks again for an excellent report. Thank you, everyone.
That's great. So finally, Councillor Howells.
Thank you, Chair. Just one question from me. I wasn't able to see a direct reference in the report. However, are there any special provisions provided for our children looked after?
I think that's a really good question, and I don't know if you will know, but we have within our inclusion service, we have the vulnerable learner lead role, and they have a particular focus for children who are looked after. So within all of our kind of provision for vulnerable learners, we would prioritise our children who are looked after in that kind of access to any of the, education support team or educational psychology service. They would have that kind of priority access to. I'm not sure if I'm phrasing that correctly, but you're right. So all of these services are available to all children, including children who may be looked after currently, but also care experienced or adopted as part of that. I think the vulnerable learner lead, and we do now have a statutory officer with a particular responsibility for children looked after. That was agreed a year. Was she in post last year? So that's a fairly recent addition to the team, because we acknowledge that obviously for our population of children who are looked after, it's significant that we get that provision correct for them, and that they're unable to access learning and learning experiences. So yeah, we do have in terms of this provision, it's available to everybody, but we do prioritise those learners in line with the expectations and acknowledging the different vulnerabilities that often are very present for our children who are looked after.
Thank you, Morwenna. And just finally, and Councillor Bonds also put the comment I was going to raise, just that question of the link that we couldn't open. Is that something you could have a look at, please? Yes. And just double check if it's possible to ensure that we could actually access those. You probably think that you've sent them, they're linked, and we can access them. It's really just feedback that we haven't. Is there a particular reason that you know of why that might be the case?
No, to be honest, we were under the understanding with our new SharePoint system that you would all be able to open those and they would be available. We can send those through as appendices.
Thank you.
That's absolutely fine. We can do that if that's the best thing to do.
Technology is yet again our friend. We must remember. Thank you very much. Councillor Howes, were you content with your
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Thanks.
So just really to say, we note this report, and thank you very much for all the contributions to it and all the questions and responses. And if I may just add to this report, as I did to the earlier one, to the emotional literacy support assistance, to the Monmouthshire Specialist Teaching Service, to the Education Support Team, and anyone else that I've missed, would you please pass on from the members of the Performance and Overview Committee how extremely grateful we are for the hard work and the amazingly important work that they do, and it is hugely valued. So when we're looking at the reports, they can all seem a little bit cold. It's not at all intended to be so. So I'd be grateful if you could pass that on.
We will absolutely do that. We relish the opportunity to celebrate the good work that's going on, and we've got an amazing, committed staff, so we're very fortunate. I will definitely pass that on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So we're going to take a short, I'm going to say 10 minutes, but if you could please ensure that it is 10 minutes, but recognising it probably takes 2 minutes to get the kettle boiling. You've then got to add cold water in order to down it. I'm going to say 10 minutes, but we'll start promptly at 5 to the hour. Thank you. Okay, so welcome back, everybody, to restart with item 7 on the agenda, which is the risk register. And I'm pleased to have Richard and Hannah here. If you'd be kind enough, when you speak, to just to indicate your role, that'd be very helpful. And I think we have Councillor Callard online. And as we're about to start, I don't know whether Councillor Callard, welcome, Councillor Callard, and thank you very much for joining. It looks like you're being attacked by a very large weed there in the background. So hopefully you make it through safely.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to leave most of the talking to Richard and Hannah today. I think I'm at home with my ill daughter, but they are more than capable.
Oh, very sorry to hear that. Best wishes to her. I hope she's quickly better. Did you have anything you wanted to indicate beforehand, or will I move it straight over to Richard and Hannah?
I'm happy for you to pass over to Richard, but if there's anything that any topics that pop up which I can cover, then I'll happily come in and pick them up.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Councillor Callard. So, Richard, over to you to introduce, and if you could just pick out the key points that are changes in particular, and anything that remains at a high level, so we can move quickly to questions from the members. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for that, Chair. Good morning, everyone. Yeah, Richard Jones, Performance and Data Insight Manager at Monmouthshire County Council. So report for you today is now what's become a regular report to committee, providing you with a 6-monthly update of the strategic risks facing the organisation and how they are being managed. The purpose for you today is to use this to understand the risk environment which we're operating in, the mitigations progress with the mitigations for those risks that have been put in place, and also if you wish to delve into some of the further detail of some of the risks, whether it's something you want to consider adding to your forward work programme or potentially referring issues to other committees where they fall within their remit as well. In terms of the particular updates that before you today, point 3.3 sets out some of the key changes that have been made to the risk register since it was last presented to you 6 months ago. So briefly, those are risk 4 around workforce has been adjusted, the nature of the risk has been adjusted and mitigations updated accordingly. Risk 9A related to school attendance has reduced, mainly reflecting progress in primary school attendance data. Nonetheless, medium level risk remains. Risk 11 has related to climate, has been divided into 2 parts to better assess and target our mitigations related to that risk. And then finally, 2 risks have been de-escalated in the strategic risk register. And it's probably important to emphasise that just because something's de-escalated from a strategic risk register doesn't mean there isn't an element of risk that still needs to be managed. For these 2 risks, they are now going to be managed via directorate risk registers, which sit below our strategic risk register and allow specific service issues of a high or medium level nature, risk nature, to continue to be assessed and managed, and if things change they could be escalated back to the strategic risk register as needed. So those are the main changes. I think it's probably worth also pointing out, I appreciate that it's a detailed document, strategic risk register, due to the nature of the wide variety of services and risks it's trying to cover. So we've tried to include within Appendix 1 a table at the start that summarises the risks, the risk levels, those at high or medium, pre or post mitigation, and then some of the key changes. So hopefully that helped guide your work today. And then finally, just to point out, in terms of further scrutiny of our risk arrangements and risk register, the arrangements to support our management of risk are scrutinised by Governance and Audit Committee, and they'll be receiving a report next week providing an update on those. Particularly, that'll be important given we are now almost nearing the end of completion of implementing our revised strategic risk management policy. Some of the changes to which you'll see actually within the strategic risk register today, and then finally it will be endorsed at Cabinet at their June meeting as well. But as ever, this risk register remains an ongoing ongoing updated document, so it will continue to be updated as things change in between. But this is the 6 monthly report we bring to you at this point in time to allow you to review the current risk environment. So, Chair, happy to hand back and obviously answer any questions.
Thank you, Richard. That's really helpful to identify the principal changes. And so it's over to colleagues if you have any questions on the report. And I see Councillor Bond, you've got your hand up first.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you very much for the report. Very comprehensive, and I understand, as you say, that there's lots of other reports that sit under this summary report. A couple of questions. I've got a couple of questions I'll say now, and then if they're not, nobody else asks them, I'll come in later if that's okay, Chair. So the first one is around the process itself. So in Appendix 3, it actually shows the matrix, the box matrix that makes the decision, but not the identification what major, substantial, moderate, minor, and likely, probable, likely mean. Maybe one in 25%, 50%, whatever. The wonder if there's some way you could give that information. I think I asked this last year, and I think I was told there's another document that supports it, but I didn't. Perhaps I ought to find that at the document. But as a resident, the identification of the number comes from using major against unlikely or whatever, doesn't it? So there's that, and who checks the equivalence, please, of that? Those assessments, is it yourselves, Richard and Hannah? And how is consistency applied? That also relates then to the process of is there a risk matrix that is produced that shows, like in Appendix 2, where you've got the risk radar? My thoughts are that some of those in there are actually risks that should be part of our risk registers, such as J, which is quite close to the centre, major adult social care provider failure, which will impact those with care and support needs, which I suggest that is very pertinent to ourselves, talking about changes in domiciliary care. So should that be in I think number 8 it should be, possibly? So how do those fit together, please? And the second question is then 1B, I remember in the last performance and overview scrutiny meeting, I asked that we could have better information. It's one of the mitigation factors, that there is a list. There is the forward plan of work and projects that's shared with us all, but my suggestion was that we had more detail on there, because we can't, as novices or people not involved in the work, can't see how that work is related to our particular residents, and therefore can't understand whether we need to call it in, referring to the constitution change which the monitoring officer made, or raise queries if we're not sure of the impact on our residents. I hope that makes sense. Does that make sense? I hope so. Thank you.
It sounded
it's the process, and then also about how we identify which pieces of work we want to scrutinise. Thank you.
Great, and it sounded very sensible from this end, Councillor Bond. I think one of the points you were raising in regard to impact on residents is a wider point about whether or not impact, as in impact and likelihood, whether it's impact on residents or if it's impact on our services, which might be two separate things. So it'd be useful just to expand that a little bit. Yeah, Richard, would you want to pick these up? Richard and Hannah?
Yeah. Thank you for the questions, Councillor Bond. Important point. So, take them in turn. If there's anything I missed, please remind me at the end. So, in terms of the risk matrix, understanding the likelihood and probability scale, likelihood and impact scale we have on there. So that is underpinned by our strategic risk management policy. Within the policy, there is categorisation of what those different levels of impact and probability are. So I can send that around to the committee for you to look at it in a bit more detail. It's not so much of a quantitative assessment, it's more of a qualitative assessment, but it does define different categories of qualitative assessment to inform and guide our work. So hopefully I'll make it clearer for you. We do try and balance in the report how much detail we include in this report in one go, but obviously hopefully the policy underpinning it will give you that further assurance. In terms of then the role of how we assess risks and then how we assure that they are assessed robustly. So the risk policy sets out a process which we go through to identify a strategic risk and how we manage it. In terms of some of the arrangements we have in place, we have our service business plans initially, and they form largely the initial identification of risk at a service level. Hannah and I use that to inform an initial risk identification report that then we report into our senior leadership team, and they will review that and identify any changes in the risk environment they feel that need to be made, informed by that, but also informed by any of the knowledge that may have or may come into the organisation at any time. As you can imagine, with risk, things happen, and it takes account of a wide variety of evidence. And we try and assure then, along with them as risk owners, that risk is robustly assessed and the impact and likelihood of that risk materialising is assessed accordingly. So there is a process in place to assure that, guided by the policy. In terms of the risk radar, thank you for sort of drawing attention to it, because it's a really important addition to our risk management process. So our risk radar is there to identify possible risks that could cause a potential impact to council or council services or the community or county of Monmouthshire as a whole. Our strategic risk register focuses on risks that could pose a high or medium level risk to the delivery of our objectives in our community corporate plan. So it does have a bit more of a focus on us as an organisation and how it will impact, but nonetheless it's important to understand how it relates to the impact of our residents and our communities as well. The risk radar is there to identify some of those potential issues that could occur and to put them, as it says on the tin, on our radar to consider as part of our strategic risk management arrangements and register, but also in terms of any other policy strategies, etc. we may be writing of how we may choose to address them. The example you gave, for example, around sort of adult social care failure, we already have a strategic risk around adult social care within our strategic risk register. At the moment, that hasn't been assessed as specific failure hasn't come out in terms of the evidence of specific risk within that, but it's on our radar should something change to consider and escalate that on it. And that's the purpose of identifying it in the radar, is that we are consciously aware and considering that escalation where needed, and obviously hopefully the risk will identify that further in terms of our current risks. So hopefully that helps explain some of the process side. Obviously we'll send around the strategy to help inform you further about the process that is in place. And as I mentioned earlier, some more of the process is scrutinised by Governance and Audit Committee as well in a bit more detail, but appreciate some of that will help you understanding an assessment of the risks in this committee. Is there anything else, Chair or Councillor Bond?
Sounded very thorough. Councillor Bond, was there anything else?
Yes, there was the. So you suggested that the policy, yes, is available, but if this is a document for residents to look at, could there be some summary of those particular criteria as part of this document, so they don't have to go searching for another document? Would that be, because the rest of it is, to me, it makes sense, but that is missing off that. So I wonder if that could be appended to this, maybe. And also the specific in 1B, I mentioned about the action because there's a reference in 1B to identifying what needs to be scrutinised by the members, and my suggestion and action was that that we have more detail on that list, because there's some action saying there, I think, that they try to make it as relevant as possible or communicated as quickly as possible and up to date and all those sort of things, but not the actual detail of it that's members like myself and residents can identify whether it does have an impact on residents within our area, and therefore we need to ask for it to be scrutinised. Yeah?
Thank you, Councillor Bond.
Makes sense?
It does. And Richard.
So in terms of being clearer on probability and impact, we can include within that appendix a summary of the different levels of categorisation that are used to inform those in future reports. That we'll add that in. And in terms of the action under 1B, just to confirm, that relates to the forward work planner. So I think what we'll probably do is make sure that your comments are fed back in to those who are responsible for coordinating and collating that work planner to consider when updating it and developing it.
Good.
Thank you. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Bond. And moving on to Councillor Buckler.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you, Richard and Hannah. Back again, six months. It's sort of occurred to me, do you think there's a sort of lack of mitigation detail in this register? You mentioned, sort of that risks they're broadly identified, such as in finance, staffing, and the climate emergency. But could we have some idea of specific mitigation actions, progress to date, or timescales, or is this part of you going to senior management, flagging up these risks, and then it's transferred to those different departments? On the sort of the mixture of sort of governance and audit and the risk register, obviously you work very closely together. So, do you think there is an undeveloped risk link between risk and budget? So, what about the sort of budget implications or reserve strategies? Do you feel that we are capturing that mixture of the risk and the implications for the council budgets? And it seems to me, climate emergency is there, sort of loud and proud, but doesn't seem fully integrated in it's quite loosely defined. So it's how do we work it in with our council budgets and our plans? It doesn't seem very clear. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Buckler.
Yeah. So thank you for the question. So I think probably again good points to provide some clarity in terms of the risk process and how it works. So in terms of the mitigating actions, it's important to capture within this risk register the mitigations we have in place to address those risks. Appreciate again, within the risk register we'll capture some of the more significant activity that is going on to mitigate that risk. Within other areas, so such as director risk register service plans, there may be further information and evidence that underpins some of this, but I think from our point of view it is important that those more significant mitigations are captured within this strategic risk register itself. So take on board your point that maybe you feel that they aren't in sufficient detail, but it is important for us that some of the key ones are captured within this document as well, and that forms part of our challenge on this, is to make sure that those are maintained and up to date. In terms of how we sorry, mine was the second question here.
Second question was about sort of linked to sort of governance and audit.
Yeah. Just a microphone if you could, Councillor Buckley.
Sorry, Chair. Thank you for reminding me about the microphone. Yeah, it's sort of links between risk and budget. You know, how developed are they? You know, sort of, yes, budget implications and reserve strategies.
So obviously the risk register itself identifies specific risks related to our finances. In terms of how we see the risk register being used, it should be one of those key documents that is taken into account when we are considering our budget or setting our budget responsibilities. Again, that's not something directly Hannah and I would get involved specifically in, but we would be, by collating and maintaining the strategic risk register, that informs, should and will inform budget considerations as they go forward. And you know, that's one alongside many reasons we have the strategic risk register to take into account of those in our budget decision making. Obviously within the limited resources we have available and many priorities we're trying to manage as a council within those. But strategic risk register is one of those important elements.
And the last one, climate. The climate emergency. Can I just say that it's so good that you're describing it in language that our residents can understand, because they may think, well, why do you need a risk register, and how does it link in with the services that we provide as a council? So I mean, that's why we're asking the questions, because I think it's very important to flag that up. But yes, and now on to the climate emergency.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, the strategic risk register's purpose is to identify high and medium level strategic risks delivery of our objectives, so those set in the community corporate plan, of which obviously climate and nature emergency is one of our priorities. So there's obviously within the risk register identified that specific risk you mentioned around that objective. Which hopefully captures some of the mitigation that we're putting in place. As with any of our priorities, again, in considering risk identification, so any changes or new or adjustments in the nature of risks that we need to add, we would take count of, is there any elements of this that could pose a risk to delivery of our commitments within our community corporate plan, so whether that be climate and nature emergency or any of our other priorities, and some of them you will see as you go through, there will be links between different elements of the risk, not necessarily climate and nature emergency related, but you'll see there's clearer links. For example, the risk around the RLDP and how that links into risk we have around homelessness and housing in the county. So some of the risks would interlink in that way, and obviously some of the ambitions, for example, of the RLDP will support our ambitions around our climate and nature emergency as well, in terms of future housing provision as well. So there's examples of where it links. Again, it's one of many considerations, and for us in identifying risk, it's making sure it's collated as clear as possible. We're focused on those areas that potentially are of more significant or higher risk to the organisation in how we identify it. Sometimes that may mean that certain things may not always get a fuller analysis within the risk register, but that doesn't mean that some of those will not be necessarily considered in other arrangements. But I think it's important to reflect that we won't be able to capture everything within every risk and every related risk. It's about making sure we're all focused. Officers, chief officers, cabinet members who are responsible, colleagues across the council, committee and our residents, to give that more succinct, higher level view. But how they integrate within each other is an important consideration.
Okay, thank you, Richard. Councillor Buckley, are you content with that? And we have finally Councillor Strong.
Thank you, Chair. Point 33, you went through the list of significant changes to the register. The one that caught my eye was the last one about the threat of legal challenges being de-escalated. Now, when I read that seemed to imply to me that there was less threat of legal challenge, whereas we get the impression that society is becoming more, and I can't say the word, litigious rather than less. we're going to be making some pretty major planning decisions in the not too distant future, I suspect, that might lead to those sort of challenges. On a national level, my Twitter feed is full of people threatening to sue each other over the Supreme Court judgment on single-sex spaces. Hopefully that won't come in our direction, but it's always a possibility. So is that the implication behind it, or is it rather that our legal team were always able to carry and mitigate the risk, and therefore it really shouldn't have been there in the first place?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Again, it's an important point, and I think allows us to illustrate the link to risk arrangements we have in place. And it's certainly more the latter part of your point there around how the risk will be managed going forward. So again, Strategic Risk Register identifies high, medium level strategic risks to the organisation. That risk was escalated onto the risk register probably about a couple of years ago, reflecting some of the environment we were in terms of potential challenges. I'll say that has changed, but we now have Directorate Risk Registers in place to make sure that any risks that are more specifically managed and carried by, for example, in this case, our legal team, can be managed at that level. Should something change, and obviously we hope it doesn't, but should something change, it could escalate back on there should the environment for that risk that change. But also, there's this corresponding mitigation around that in terms of how we make sure the decisions we're taking, we're fully assessing the impact of those, etc., to make sure they're robust as well. But in this case, it's not to necessarily say the risk hasn't diminished, but it will be managed and carried within our legal team on there as part of Directorate Risk Register, and will be monitored, and if needs be, it'll be escalated back.
Okay, so as I understand it, the risk of a legal challenge hasn't gone down, but our ability to deal with such a risk has gone up, and therefore it's no longer really a strategic risk. Yeah, that be a correct summary.
Yeah.
That great word mitigation strikes again. Yeah. Thank you. I see no further questions, so I've got just a couple if I may. And Councillor Callard, you would feel entirely left out if I didn't ask something about finance, I know. But if I could just ask about the last quarter that we were briefed on the pressures, the financial pressures, and this extends from Councillor Buckler's question earlier, that the financial pressures had increased to 23.7 million. And the medium-term financial gap had increased. So I'm interested to understand how we could be grading the risk as having reduced if those things remain the same. And we're not party to the latest financial position, so it might be that you would be able to help on that. The second part of that is on schools reserves, which have also at the last time we had the opportunity to see where they would be, they were increasing from the school deficit, increasing, and that would be a concern. I couldn't see where the deficit in the schools was actually being picked up as a risk, other than more generally. And again, it would be helpful just to understand that a little bit more. The third one is on really the way in which we calibrate which are the priorities of all the risks. So we might individually assess an individual risk at a certain level, but is it more important than other aspects that we might well grade? So to give the particular example, we're looking at the decarbonisation as a risk that scores 12. Were we not able to meet net zero by 2030? And we're grading at 8 if we are unable to return school attendance to the levels that we saw before the pandemic. And in terms of the calibration of risk, which would presumably drive the priorities for the council, such that we would put activity behind those as priorities, and with respecting entirely all the arguments that people will make around net zero by 2030, I wonder if it's significantly less important than the impact on young people for life if we are unable to return those young people to, or support returning them to school. Because the last time we looked at that information, we saw that free school, children with access to free school meals was running at a level of something approaching 18% non-attendance. So it's just really, how on earth do we take a look and stand back once we've actually graded the risk of individual risks and say, actually, yeah, but those 3 or 4 or 5 are the top priorities because they have much greater impact on our residents than other issues? Or do we just simply leave them at the level where individual risks are graded? So yeah, thank you for, if you are able to just respond to those. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chair. I'll just come in briefly if it's okay, and then maybe Richard or Hannah can come in on a bit of the detail about some of the risks. On picking up your first point about finance, it's a fluctuating picture, as you can imagine. I mean, last year when we brought out the medium-term financial strategy, the gap then was about £34 million, if I remember correctly. So it's on a trajectory. It's going to fluctuate on that trajectory, as I would expect. The committee, I'm sure, will be looking forward to us bringing the outturn report through, which I think will be happening in July, if my understanding is correct. And I would say it's just around that, and it speaks to the position on schools' balances as well, is that we are seeing movement in the right direction. We can go into more depth on that when the paper is published and when we meet again. So it is still a risk. It's still something that we are concerned about. But my belief is that we are being prudent and we are managing the situation. On to a really interesting point you bring up about like comparing risks, the school attendance versus climate change. I think that is a really interesting topic about how you actually compare some quite separate concepts, and not only are they quite separate, the power that council has to influence them is also vastly different. So you mentioned about the council basing its priorities on some of those risks, and I think where the council has capacity and is able to influence those risks, then it's right that we do work, that we prioritise the mitigation of those risks. You talk about school attendance, things like that. With climate change, we know the risks involved. We've seen over the last few years some of the flooding in our communities, which is projected to get worse, and the costs associated with that are huge, not just to the council, but to the people affected. But again, if this council, its operations became carbon neutral tomorrow, I think we can all appreciate around this table that, as desirable as that is, it's probably not going to change the likelihood of some of those severe impacts we see from climate change, because this council, is not a major emitter of carbon emissions globally. We're part of a bigger picture. So, it's an interesting concept. I mean, Richard or Hannah might have some more views on that, about how we compare those risks and how we use them to prioritise the work we do. But I suppose from my view, the risk register and its purpose is to not necessarily talk about like prioritizing work in order to respond to the risks. It's about putting the correct mitigations in place to the level that we can, because we know we can't mitigate all the risks that we face, in order that we reduce risks as much as reasonably possible. Did you want to add anything, Richard?
Yeah, thank you for that explanation, Councillor Callard, and those examples. I think for us in identifying strategic risk, any strategic risk that makes it onto Council strategic risk register is important. It's assessed with the evidence available to give the risk score relevant to each of those specific risks, and then the mitigations managed accordingly. So I think your explanation there is really helpful. I think, Chair, is anything further?
Yeah, just really, and obviously there are aspects of this which we could talk about for a very long time, and I fully respect there are going to be different approaches. But the first point, thank you, Councillor Callard, for the responses. But on the financial questions, it really was to ask if the comparison to last year. That our medium-term financial gap has increased, and if the financial pressures from year to year have increased, as we were indicated they were, to 23.7 million at the previous quarter, how could that correlate to a decrease in the scoring? And yeah, the point about the oversight of what drives our priorities as a council, I think your point is a really well made, that there are those things we can do something about, those things we can't do too much about, and they're all important. But it's this understanding that non-attendance of pupils at school being graded at 8 as a sort of low to medium grade, that has such massive consequences, and it does make me wonder whether or not, as a county council, we really understand the consequences of non-attendance at school, and the extent to which, it could drive more activity, more prioritisation, whatever that would look like by us as a council, to say, look, we cannot allow that to happen. So we have to get to a point where we've got all our children at school, and we're wildly off that. So it's really just those 2 points, and I don't want to extend the discussion. We can always talk about it off.
Thank you, Chair. On the finance side, I mentioned you talked about the gap is increasing, and how is the risk decreasing as the gap is increasing, but since as I mentioned, since the financial strategy came out, we were predicting a gap of between 34 and 35 million pounds. That gap is getting smaller, and you'd expect that. It will get smaller as we go through the term of the medium-term financial plan, because at the end of it, we expect to net out. So I'm, from my perspective, I'm pretty comfortable with where we are there in the risk, and I hope that when we bring the outturn report to this committee, that it will provide some comfort to the committee as well, that this risk is being managed sufficiently. On the getting attendance levels back up in school, I mean, you're right to say that we need to do all we can to get children, especially those from more deprived backgrounds, those receiving free school meals, their attendance levels back up. I think, to be honest, the members of our education directorate would probably be best to give you a fuller answer about the steps that we're taking in order to do that, and the mitigations that we're putting in place in order to do that. I'm probably not the best equipped to do that, but only to concur that it's something that we should put resource into, and that we should make sure that we can do what we can.
Thank you, Councillor Callard. It's obviously it's an interesting discussion, and not one that just stops here, but it's one I'm sure we can all pay more focus to. The school attendance issue, and anything that we can add to supporting it, I'm sure we'll all want to do. Thank you. And Councillor Bond, I see your hand is up. I also see Councillor Strong's hand up. Is that an old hand? I don't mean to describe you as an old hand. I'm saying that is a legacy hand, I think is the appropriate word. Councillor Bond, I think you had a question or a follow-up.
Yes. First of all, can I just say that I totally support you about when we've previously used integrated risk registers, the overview, such as that radar report where you see all the risks against each other, helps you to sense check which is the priority, and also helps you with the consistency, because then you say, why is that one high priority? Surely that one isn't, but related to all of them. And I completely agree with you, Chair, that helps then resource allocation, or at least understanding what the major risks are. So, and it's about resultant post-mitigation, Councillor Callard, post-mitigation risk remaining after mitigation. That is obviously the important thing that would be on that overview matrix or diagram. So something on 2, I noticed that there's and elsewhere there's very little reference to efficiency, identifying waste, and lean processes, identifying that. I see on 4 there's fantastic about the well-being, and the only other one I was going to mention, if it's okay, my understanding of the 11B from 16 to 12, I would find that difficult to comprehend given the mitigation, as for example Caldecott is still under TAN 15 in risk of flooding, so that affects our building or probability for building. So I'm not sure that I would really, and I'm on the climate group, so I'll ask this question, why that has gone down. But that sort of overview, which is what Chair was saying, overview diagram of the resultant risk scores for each of them would then give you a sense check, and you better see, does that make sense? Is that our highest priority? Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you, Councillor Barnett. It's this fundamental point that it might be something that really is a non-partisan issue. It's one about saying what are the most important priorities for the council, and if we're assessing risks at the highest level, that would, you would say that would normally drive your focus on prioritisation, and that might drive the focus on where we put our greatest efforts. But yeah, I mean, it's clearly a discussion we can take forward, and I'm sure it's one that we will want to do that. I don't see any other hands up, so I'm going to say that we have come to the end of that agenda item. Thank you very much for all the responses, and also to the officers for pulling the report together in comprehensive detail. We'd be grateful if you could let everyone know that we appreciate it and we've really looked at it. It's important to us, and it's not just a bit of process from our point of view. It really is. It really matters. So thank you for that. Thank you, Richard and Hannah. And this is a special meeting, therefore we don't have minutes. We'll have them at next week's meeting. We don't have meetings every week throughout the year. Those, Councillor Newell, you're relatively new. It's not every week of the year. It just so happens I've had to line up 3 in June because quite a number of reports we needed to deal with. I think Robert just wants to come in.
Yeah, sorry, just because we don't have the forward work programme on today's agenda, I just wanted to call everyone's attention verbally to remind you about the scrutiny workshop on the 16th of June for social care, to which you've received an invitation, but also that we've added the special on the 9th of July, which I've emailed about, but the invitations haven't gone out for that yet, but they will do so imminently, and that's for domiciliary care procurement with people members invited as well. So just wanted to remind everyone of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. So it seems like a hard stop because we're not doing minutes or anything like that, but we'll see you again next week. Thank you very much for everyone's involvement, and have a good day. Cheer for now.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you.